In the peaceful suburban community of Mission Viejo, California, everything seemed perfect. The streets were lined with rows of meticulously manicured homes, their pristine lawns an advertisement for the ideal American life. The air was crisp, as autumn began to take hold, the golden hues of the leaves casting long shadows over the quiet neighborhood. People greeted one another with warm smiles, and families walked their dogs along the winding paths that led through parks and around the tranquil Lake Mission Viejo. It was a place that screamed comfort, safety, and security, a place where every neighbor knew each other's name, and appearances were everything. But behind the perfectly painted white fences of the Carter family home, things were not as idyllic as they seemed. Emma Carter stood in front of the large bay window of her living room, her hands pressed gently against the cool glass. Her gaze wandered over the lush landscape outside, but it wasn't the beauty that caught her attention. It was the nagging feeling that she had been trapped here, in this perfect little bubble, too long. At 35, Emma found herself questioning everything she once believed to be true about her life. The home she shared with James was a beautiful, sprawling house in the heart of Mission Viejo, but it had become a hollow shell. The walls that once echoed with laughter and love now stood silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. James Carter, her husband of 12 years, was a man who had everything, or so it seemed. He was successful, driven, and deeply engrossed in his work at a prestigious law firm in Irvine. But his success came at a price. Emma had long since stopped expecting him to come home on time for dinner, let alone show interest in her life. The late nights at the office, the endless business trips, the rare weekends spent apart, it had all added up. The distance between them had become a quiet, growing chasm, one that neither of them knew how to cross. Emma was no longer the vibrant woman James had once fallen in love with. She had become a shadow of her former self. The charm, the laughter, the warmth, all had dulled over time, replaced by a quiet resignation. She'd tried to fill the void with community events, charity work, and organizing neighborhood gatherings, but those too had begun to feel like empty gestures, distractions from the gnawing loneliness that now consumed her. Her thoughts were interrupted as she heard the familiar sound of James' car pulling into the driveway. He was home. But even as she heard the engine shut off, the door creaking open, and his heavy footsteps echoing through the house, Emma felt nothing. She had long since stopped feeling excitement at his arrival. She turned away from the window, her gaze drifting to the polished surface of the kitchen counter, her mind wandering to places she could not yet admit. James entered the house, his briefcase in hand, his eyes scanning the room. "Emma," he called out, his voice detached. She turned, offering a faint smile. "Hey, you're early." He gave a distracted nod, not really noticing the weariness in her eyes. "Yeah, had a light day. Thought I'd take you out for dinner." But the invitation felt hollow. She nodded, half-heartedly. "Sounds nice." But inside, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same. It was then, standing in that immaculate house, that Emma began to wonder, was this all there was? Her life had become a series of quiet routines, each day blending into the next. Until the day she met him. The following week, Emma couldn't help but notice the new family that had moved into the house next door. It had been empty for months, a house swallowed by overgrown grass and the occasional flicker of movement from behind the windows. Now, the lawn was manicured, the curtains drawn open, and a fresh coat of paint was already applied to the front door. The house had come alive again, and with it, a sense of curiosity that Emma couldn't quite shake. It was late afternoon when she first saw him. Emma was tending to the rose bushes in her front yard when a car pulled into the driveway next door. She looked up instinctively, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her apron. The door to the sleek black sedan opened, and out stepped a young man, tall, dark-haired, wearing a casual yet stylish suit that seemed to fit him effortlessly. He paused for a moment, looking around as if getting his bearings, before heading toward the front door. The sun, Emma thought, remembering the old owners mentioning a son who was studying abroad. Must be him. It wasn't just the way he looked, tall and confident with striking features, his broad shoulders tapering down into a slim waist, it was the way he carried himself. There was a quiet, undeniable magnetism about him. Even from across the yard, Emma felt the pull of his presence. She didn't recognize the feeling, not since the early days of her marriage to James, when she would have sworn that the world could stop spinning with just a glance from him. A few days later, Emma ran into him again, this time on the sidewalk while she was returning from the mailbox. Aidan was walking his dog, a golden retriever with a collar that jingled in rhythm with his steps. He smiled as he noticed her, and Emma felt her chest tighten slightly. She hadn't expected to be seen, hadn't expected the way his gaze lingered on her, warm but unassuming. "Hi there," he greeted her with a friendly tone. "I'm Aidan Malik. Just moved in next door." Emma offered a polite smile, trying to push away the strange flutter in her stomach. "I'm Emma Carter. Welcome to the neighborhood." She extended her hand, and he shook it firmly, his grip surprisingly strong. She noticed the warmth of his skin and something else in his eyes, something deep and knowing, as if he saw straight through her to the part of herself she kept hidden. "I've heard a lot about you from the neighbors," Aidan said, his voice light but with an undertone of genuine interest. "You're the one who organizes all the events, right?" "Yeah," Emma laughed softly, feeling a bit self-conscious. "I like to keep busy. It's part of the charm of living in a place like this, I guess." "I can imagine," Aidan replied, his smile widening. "It must be nice to live in such a close-knit community." Emma nodded, surprised by how natural it felt to speak with him. There was a casual ease about Aidan that made her feel less on guard, less like she was being judged or scrutinized, something she hadn't realized she craved until now. As they spoke, Aidan's dog tugged at his leash, pulling him toward the sidewalk. He chuckled, apologizing as he adjusted his grip. "I guess I'll let you get back to your day. Maybe we'll see each other around?" "Yeah, definitely," Emma said, smiling again, this time without the hesitation she'd felt earlier. She watched as he turned and walked away, his movements smooth and confident. The breeze picked up slightly, and Emma was left standing there, her pulse quickening for reasons she couldn't explain. Over the next few weeks, their encounters became more frequent. Sometimes, Emma would see Aidan leaving for work in the morning, his tailored suits gliding through the street, his eyes always meeting hers with a knowing glint. Other times, she'd catch him walking the dog, or they'd briefly cross paths at the grocery store. They never lingered for long, but there was always an unspoken connection that seemed to draw them together, like two magnets drawn by an invisible force. It wasn't until the neighborhood block party that Emma and Aidan had their first real conversation. The event, which Emma had spent days organizing, was in full swing, with the aroma of grilled burgers and the chatter of families filling the air. As Emma walked between the groups, making sure everything was running smoothly, she spotted Aidan standing alone near the punch bowl, looking somewhat detached from the rest of the crowd. His eyes met hers as she approached, and he flashed a smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Having fun?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual, though there was an undeniable warmth in her voice that surprised even her. Aidan chuckled. "It's a bit much, I suppose. I'm not really the type to socialize in big groups. But I thought I'd make an appearance. You seem like the social butterfly of the neighborhood." Emma smiled, a bit flattered by his words. "It's a lot of work, honestly, but it's worth it. Keeps me busy." She looked around, making sure no one was overhearing. "I'm actually relieved to have a moment to breathe." "I can see that," Aidan said, stepping a bit closer, his voice lowering as if sharing a secret. "I like your energy, Emma. There's something about you that's hard to ignore." The compliment, so direct and unashamed, made Emma's heart race. She tried to laugh it off, but the way Aidan looked at her made it clear he wasn't just being polite. There was something deeper behind his words, something that made Emma feel seen, appreciated in a way she hadn't felt in years. "Thanks," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt a flutter in her chest, the kind of feeling she hadn't experienced since the early days of her marriage to James. "What is this?" she wondered, her thoughts swirling. Aidan's eyes softened. "I know this might sound forward, but, would you like to grab coffee sometime? I'd love to hear more about your work with the neighborhood." It wasn't just the invitation, it was the way he said it, like he wasn't just interested in small talk, but in truly getting to know her. The warmth in his gaze, the way his smile lingered just a little too long, made Emma's breath hitch. She could feel herself drawn to him, despite the hesitation that tugged at the back of her mind. "I'd like that," Emma replied before she could think better of it. The words left her lips before she had time to question them. Aidan's smile widened. "Great. I'll text you," he said, before turning to rejoin the conversation at the punch bowl. Emma stood there for a moment, a rush of emotions flooding her. She hadn't expected to feel this way, not now, not with everything going on in her life. But in that fleeting moment, she realized something she hadn't dared admit for years: she was intrigued. She was drawn to him. The feeling was undeniable. And the more Emma thought about it, the more she couldn't ignore it. The days that followed the invitation to coffee felt both suffocating and electrifying for Emma. Each time she saw Aidan, a rush of emotions swirled within her: excitement, guilt, and a growing desire to be near him. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt truly seen, truly heard. Not since the early days of her marriage to James, when every touch, every glance, felt charged with newness and possibility. But with James, those days had long passed. What had been once bright and full of promise now felt like a shadow of its former self. Aidan was different. There was no pretense with him, no expectations. He listened to her in a way James never had, offering more than just the bare minimum of polite responses. Every word he spoke seemed to invite Emma deeper into his world, into a space where her every thought, every feeling, could be acknowledged. And it wasn't just the conversations that captivated her, it was the way Aidan made her feel: important, special, desirable. They met for coffee the following Sunday, at a quiet cafe tucked away in a corner of Mission Viejo. It was a small, unassuming place, with mismatched furniture and the soft hum of a jazz record playing in the background. Aidan arrived first, his usual calm presence settling into the room as soon as he entered. He stood to greet Emma as she walked through the door, his smile wide and genuine. "Hey, Emma," he greeted her softly, as though they had known each other for years. "I'm glad you came." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She smiled, trying to act casual, but inside she was anything but. "Thanks for the invite, Aidan. I've been looking forward to this." They sat down in a cozy corner booth, each of them with a cup of steaming coffee in front of them. The conversation began easily, as it always did. At first, they talked about work, about the mundane details of neighborhood life. But soon enough, their conversation drifted toward deeper, more personal topics. "I've been thinking a lot about the neighborhood lately," Emma said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "It's strange, you know? Everyone knows each other, yet everyone is so disconnected. It's like we all wear these perfect masks, pretending that everything is fine. But really, we're just avoiding the truth." Aidan watched her with a quiet intensity. He didn't look away as she spoke, his gaze focused on her with an unnerving familiarity. "I get that," he replied, his voice smooth. "It's easy to hide behind the walls we build for ourselves. But what happens when those walls start to close in?" Emma's throat tightened at his words. She didn't know why, but they felt personal. They felt as though Aidan had somehow glimpsed the cracks in her life that she had so carefully concealed. "I think I've been doing that for a while," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "Pretending. But lately, I've been questioning everything. About my life, about who I am. And I don't even know where to begin fixing it." Aiden leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. "You don't have to fix everything right away, Emma. Sometimes, just being honest with yourself is the hardest part." His eyes locked onto hers, and the air between them shifted. There was a weight in the silence that followed, something that neither of them could ignore. "I don't know what to do anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I feel like I'm losing myself." Aiden's hand reached out, almost instinctively, and rested gently on top of hers. The touch was light, tender, but it sent a jolt of electricity through Emma's body. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her heart raced as she looked down at his hand on hers, then back up into his eyes. They were dark and full of something she couldn't quite name, but it was there, undeniable. "I'm here, Emma," he said softly. "I'm here to listen. You're not alone in this." The words were simple, but in that moment, they felt like a lifeline. Emma could feel the walls she had built around herself begin to crack, bit by bit. She knew it was wrong, knew she should pull away, but she couldn't. Not when Aiden made her feel like this. Not when everything else in her life seemed so empty. Over the next few weeks, their meetings became more frequent, their conversations more intimate. What had begun as innocent coffee dates soon turned into late-night walks, secret exchanges of stolen glances and whispered words. They met in hidden corners of the neighborhood, behind the park, in the quiet solitude of a local bookstore, or even in the quiet coffee shop that had become their refuge. Each time they met, Emma felt both exhilarated and terrified. She knew what they were doing was wrong, knew it would hurt James beyond measure if he ever found out. But every time she saw Aiden, every time they spoke, the connection between them deepened, and Emma found herself craving it more and more. Aiden wasn't just a distraction, he was a mirror, showing her a version of herself that had been buried for so long. A version that felt seen, appreciated, and understood. He asked her questions no one had bothered to ask in years. He listened, really listened, to her thoughts and dreams, to the parts of her soul she had long kept hidden. The attraction between them was undeniable. What began as simple flirtation soon escalated into something far more dangerous. One evening, as they walked along a secluded trail near the lake, the air thick with unspoken words, Aiden stopped suddenly and turned to her. "Emma," he said, his voice low and husky. "I don't want to be just someone you talk to. I want to be someone who makes you feel alive. Someone who makes you feel wanted." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. And before she could process what was happening, Aiden leaned in and kissed her. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if they were both testing the waters. But then, as the seconds stretched on, the kiss deepened, and Emma felt the world fall away. She didn't care about the consequences. She didn't care about anything except the way Aiden's lips felt against hers, the way his touch seemed to set fire to her skin. When they finally pulled away, Emma's heart was pounding in her chest. Her breath was shallow, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She knew this was wrong. She knew it wasn't just a simple kiss. But in that moment, all she could think about was how much she had longed for this, how much she had longed to feel desired, to feel like she mattered. "I've wanted this for so long," Aiden whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I know you have too." Emma couldn't deny it. She had wanted this. She had needed it. And now, there was no turning back. The days after the kiss were a blur for Emma. The world felt heavier somehow, as if every moment spent away from Aiden was a moment too long. The rush of emotions that had swept over her during their secret rendezvous lingered, coloring everything in shades of desire and guilt. She told herself that it was just a fleeting escape, something that would pass. But deep down, Emma knew it was more than that. Aiden had become a part of her life in a way that James never could, and the thought of losing that connection terrified her. At first, James didn't seem to notice the subtle shifts in Emma's behavior. He was too preoccupied with his work, his career demands consuming every waking hour. But as the weeks passed, his attention began to drift back to their marriage, or what was left of it. He noticed the small things, the way Emma's smile seemed a little too forced, the way she spent more time away from the house, the late nights out. It was as if she was trying to avoid him, trying to escape from the life they had built together. One evening, after returning home from another late meeting, James found himself standing at the kitchen counter, staring at the pile of unopened bills and paperwork he hadn't gotten to. His briefcase was still sitting by the door, untouched, a reminder of the work that always came first. But it wasn't the bills or the documents that occupied his mind that evening. It was Emma. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something was wrong, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He decided to confront her. When Emma finally returned home, it was late again. She was tired, her makeup slightly smudged, as if she had just finished a long day. James watched her carefully as she entered the living room, her footsteps hesitant, almost cautious. He could sense the distance between them, a chasm that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. But tonight, he wasn't going to let it slide. "Emma," James said, his voice low but steady, as he sat down across from her. "Where were you?" She froze, momentarily caught off guard. She looked at him, her expression guarded. "I was out with some friends," she replied, too quickly, too smoothly. James narrowed his eyes, the nagging feeling in his gut growing stronger. "You've been out a lot lately. It's not like you to be gone for hours at a time. And when I ask where you are, it's always the same vague answer." Emma hesitated, guilt flickering in her eyes. She didn't want to lie to him, but at the same time, she couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. She wasn't sure if she even wanted to. The guilt was overwhelming, but the pull of Aiden was stronger. "I told you," she said softly, avoiding his gaze. "I've just been busy. Things have been hectic." James leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp, searching for any hint of honesty in her words. He had always trusted her, but now that trust felt like a fragile thread, ready to snap. The tension in the room was thick, as if everything had been leading to this moment. "I don't believe you," he said finally, his voice cold, the words landing like a slap. "You're hiding something, Emma. And I need to know what it is." Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew she couldn't keep up the act forever, but she wasn't ready to face the truth. Not yet. Not when the weight of her actions felt so heavy on her soul. "I'm not hiding anything, James," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You're just overthinking things. Everything's fine." But James could tell she was lying. The look in her eyes, the way she couldn't meet his gaze, told him everything he needed to know. His suspicion had been right. Something was going on. But what? The next few days passed in a haze of tension. James found himself watching Emma more closely, his every instinct on high alert. He began to notice things he had overlooked before, the way she would smile when she got a text, quickly tucking her phone away when he entered the room. The way she would glance at the clock, then hurry off to the car without explanation. There were times when he caught her staring off into space, her mind clearly elsewhere, and it unsettled him. It was as if she was hiding a part of herself from him, a part he couldn't reach. One evening, as Emma was preparing dinner in the kitchen, James couldn't resist the urge to take a look at her phone. He knew it was wrong, but the doubts in his mind had begun to consume him. His heart raced as he reached for it, glancing at the screen. The lock screen was nothing out of the ordinary, just a picture of the two of them at a family gathering. But when he unlocked the phone and scrolled through the messages, his stomach dropped. There it was. A message from Aiden. "I can't wait to see you tonight, my love. We'll make it our secret again, just like we always do." James' breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled as he read the words over and over. The pain hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a simple affair, this was a betrayal. A deep, soul-crushing betrayal. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he had just read. He felt a surge of anger, but it was mixed with something far more overwhelming, a crushing sense of loss. His entire world, the world he had built with Emma, was collapsing around him. He couldn't confront her yet. Not like this. He needed to know more. He needed to see it with his own eyes, to understand the full extent of the lies she had been living. Over the next few days, James followed Emma. He kept his distance, careful not to let her see him. He watched as she drove to a local park, a place they used to visit together. He stayed hidden in the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he saw it. He saw her meet Aidan by the park's edge. They embraced. It wasn't a simple hug. It was intimate, the way lovers embrace. They stood there, holding each other, before sitting down on a bench. They were laughing, talking closely, their hands touching in a way that made James' stomach turn. It was clear now. There was no denying it. Emma was having an affair. With Aidan Malik. The man who had come into their lives as a stranger had become the one to steal her heart. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. The anger bubbled to the surface, raw and untamed. He couldn't stay hidden any longer. He had to confront them. He had to make her see the truth. But deep down, as he watched them from the shadows, James knew nothing would ever be the same again. The tension between James and Emma had reached a breaking point. His mind had been racing since that moment in the park when he had witnessed Emma's betrayal with his own eyes. The world around him had collapsed, and every fiber of his being screamed for answers. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The trust between him and Emma was shattered, and all that was left was the painful reality that she had been hiding something from him, something that had festered for weeks, maybe months. James knew he had to confront her, but he couldn't stop the fury that bubbled up inside him. It wasn't just the affair, it was the lies, the deceit, the fact that she had been living two lives while he remained in the dark. He had trusted her, had built a life with her, and now, all of it seemed like a cruel joke. That evening, after dinner, or what passed for dinner in their broken home, James snapped. He could no longer hold it in. His voice was cold, filled with barely restrained anger, as he looked at Emma sitting across from him at the dining table. "Who is he?" he demanded, his voice thick with pain and rage. "Tell me. I saw you. Don't lie to me anymore. I know what's been going on." Emma's face went pale. She didn't even try to hide the guilt in her eyes. Her silence was deafening. James could see the truth written across her face, but the words refused to leave her lips. She opened her mouth to speak but closed it again, struggling to find an answer. The weight of her actions was too much, even for her. "Answer me!" James shouted, standing up abruptly, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think I don't know? You've been sneaking around behind my back with that man, haven't you? Aidan Malik, the new guy next door. I've seen you with him. I've seen it all." Emma's eyes welled up with tears, but she remained silent, unable to look him in the eye. James could feel the world slipping away from him. He took a step toward her, his voice shaking with fury. "You owe me an explanation. You owe me the truth, Emma. I never meant for it to happen like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted to hurt you, James. But it was too late. The damage was done." James could no longer hear her words, only the anger and disbelief echoing in his mind. "That's all you've got to say?" His words were bitter, dripping with contempt. "You never wanted to hurt me? But you've been sleeping with him, Emma. You've been lying to me. All this time, I've been here, working, trying to make this family work, and you've been out there, betraying me with him. You've destroyed everything." Emma's shoulders slumped, and the tears began to fall freely. She had no defense, no excuse. She had betrayed him, and now she had to face the consequences of her actions. James couldn't stand to be in the same room with her. He couldn't even look at her without feeling sick. "I can't do this anymore," he muttered, turning to walk away. "I need to talk to him. I need to confront him. I need to make him understand what he's done to our family." The following evening, after the storm had settled, or so it seemed, James drove to the Malik family's house. His hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and his mind was filled with a boiling rage that he couldn't quite contain. He had to make Aiden see the damage he had caused. He had to make him understand that he was the reason his entire world was falling apart. When he arrived, he didn't hesitate. He stormed up to the front door, his fists clenched and his heart racing. He knocked hard, the sound echoing in the quiet suburban night. It wasn't long before the door opened, revealing Ryan Malik, Aiden's father. The older man's eyes narrowed as he saw James standing on the doorstep, his face contorted with anger. "Can I help you?" Ryan asked, his voice calm but laced with caution. "I need to talk to your son," James growled, his tone heavy with tension. "I know what he's done. I know about the affair." Ryan's face froze for a moment, then softened slightly, though there was a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "What are you talking about? Aiden would never." "Don't lie to me." James snapped, his voice rising. "I saw them together. I've seen them. My wife, your son. How long has this been going on? How long have you known?" Ryan's expression shifted from confusion to something more defensive. "I don't know what you think you saw, but my son would never do something like this." James stepped forward, his anger boiling over. "He's been seeing my wife behind my back. And you've known. You've known, haven't you?" He was practically shouting now, the pain of betrayal making his chest tighten. Ryan took a step back, his composure cracking. "I don't know what you think you saw, but this isn't the way to handle this," he said, his voice strained. "Let's talk about this calmly." James wasn't listening. He pushed past Ryan into the house, his eyes searching for Aiden. "Where is he?" he demanded. Ryan's face grew hard. "You don't just walk into my home, Anne." But James was past caring. He needed answers. He needed to make this man understand the pain his son had caused. "Where is he?" he shouted again, his voice filled with rage. It was then that Nadia Malik, Aiden's mother, appeared in the hallway. Her eyes were wide with alarm as she took in the scene. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice trembling. James turned to her, his frustration turning into something darker. "Your son is destroying my family. He's been sleeping with my wife. I saw them together. You have to know what he's done." Nadia looked at Ryan, her face pale. The shock was evident in her eyes, but Ryan quickly stepped in, trying to calm the situation. "This is not the way to resolve things, James. We'll handle this quietly, calmly. Please, let's just sit down and talk about this." But James could no longer control himself. He had heard enough. The silence, the shocked faces, it all felt like a trap. His anger, his pain, exploded. "You don't get it," James spat, his words cutting through the thick air. "You let this happen. You let your son tear my life apart, and you did nothing." The confrontation left both families shaken. Tensions were high, and emotions ran deep. The quiet suburban neighborhood that had once been a symbol of peaceful living was now the backdrop for a battle that no one could ignore. Whispers began to spread, and in the days that followed, the once perfect community was rocked by scandal. Emma's betrayal, Aiden's role in it, and the explosive conflict between the families left a mark that would never be erased. The days following the confrontation were a blur for Emma. Her world, once so meticulously crafted, had been shattered. The arguments with James, the angry stares, the quiet moments when neither of them spoke, everything was becoming unbearable. She had tried to apologize, to make things right, but the rift between them had become so wide, so deep, that nothing she said seemed to matter. James had become a stranger in their home, the man she had once loved now a reflection of her own failure. She could see the contempt in his eyes, the pain that she had caused. The once warm house now felt cold, filled only with the ghosts of their broken dreams. Emma knew it was too late to turn back. She had crossed a line, and nothing would be the same again. But despite the guilt and the despair that gnawed at her, Emma couldn't let go of Aidan. Every text, every stolen moment felt like a fleeting escape from the harsh reality she had created. Aidan made her feel alive, made her feel seen in a way that James never could anymore. Each meeting, each conversation was like a drug, and Emma was addicted. She found herself slipping deeper and deeper into a world of secrets and lies, unable to break free. It was one of those late evenings when Emma, caught in the pull of her secret life, found herself sneaking away once again. James had gone to bed early after another long day of avoiding her, and she seized the opportunity to meet Aidan. She drove to the park, her heart racing with excitement and fear. She told herself that this would be the last time, that she would walk away, that she would fix things with James, but the moment she saw Aidan waiting by the edge of the lake, she knew she couldn't resist him. Aidan's presence was magnetic, and as she approached him, their eyes met. Without a word, he took her hand and led her to the quiet spot where they had shared so many stolen moments. The soft lapping of the water against the shore and the distant hum of traffic were the only sounds that filled the silence. But there was tension in the air, an unspoken understanding that something had to give. "We can't keep doing this, Emma," Aidan said, his voice low, but filled with urgency. He seemed to sense the weight of their secret, and Emma knew he was right. "I know," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "But I can't stop, Aidan. You make me feel something I haven't felt in so long. I'm so sorry for what I've done to James, but I don't know how to let go of this." "Let go of you?" Aidan took a step closer, his eyes filled with a mix of longing and regret. He cupped her face in his hands, and for a moment, the world outside of this moment disappeared. "I don't want you to let go of me, Emma," he said quietly. "I don't want to be the reason you destroy everything, but I can't stay away either." The tension between them was palpable. The attraction, the need, the pull, it was undeniable. They had crossed a line, and they both knew it. But in that moment, there was no turning back. Their lips met, desperate and urgent, a kiss that carried all the unspoken words they had been too afraid to say. But just as quickly as the passion had flared, Emma's heart skipped a beat. She heard the sound of tires screeching to a halt on the gravel, and before she could react, she saw a figure emerge from the shadows. James. His face was a mask of fury and disbelief as he strode toward them, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His eyes locked onto Emma and Aidan, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. "What the hell is going on here?" James' voice was a low growl, filled with the kind of anger Emma had never heard before. He was shaking with rage, and his fists were clenched at his sides. Emma stepped back instinctively, her heart pounding in her chest. "James, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, let me explain." But James wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on Aidan, and his expression twisted with rage. "You," he spat, his voice cracking with emotion. "You've destroyed my life, my family, everything I've worked for. You think you can just come into my home, into my life, and take what's mine?" Aidan stood his ground, his face tense with the weight of the situation. "James, it's not what you think. It's exactly what I think," James shouted, his voice booming in the night air. "You've been sleeping with my wife, and you think I'm just going to stand here and let it happen? You're a coward, Aidan. A coward who took everything from me." Emma tried to move closer to James, to calm him, but he stepped back, his eyes wide with fury. The man she had once known, the man she thought she loved, had been consumed by rage, and she had no idea how to bring him back. In the blink of an eye, everything spiraled out of control. James charged at Aiden, his body a blur of motion. Aiden tried to step back, but James was too fast. The two men collided with a sickening thud, and in the chaos that ensued, James' hands grabbed anything he could find. His fury was unchecked, and as Aiden struggled to defend himself, Emma screamed for them to stop. She tried to pull James away, but the violence of the situation was too much. Her body shook with fear, her mind racing as she watched the two men tear at each other. In the midst of the struggle, James' hand found a nearby metal pipe that had been left near the edge of the lake, and without thinking, he swung it at Aiden. The blow landed with a sickening crack. Aiden's body went limp as he crumpled to the ground, blood pooling around his head. Emma's scream pierced the night, a gut-wrenching sound that echoed across the lake. She fell to her knees beside Aiden, her hands trembling as she touched his face, but it was too late. He was gone. James stood there, his breath ragged, his face pale as he stared at the lifeless body of the man who had stolen everything from him. The weight of what he had just done began to sink in. He had killed Aiden, not in self-defense, not in any moment of clarity, but in a fit of blind, uncontrollable rage. As Emma collapsed beside Aiden's body, her mind spinning with horror, she realized that her life, their lives, would never be the same again. The affair, the lies, the betrayal, it had all led to this. And now, there was no undoing what had been done. The sound of sirens filled the air, getting louder with every passing second, but Emma barely heard them. All she could focus on was the man she loved, the man she had betrayed, and the terrible consequences that would follow. The sirens grew louder as they neared, but for Emma, time seemed to slow down. Her hands trembled as they hovered over Aiden's lifeless body, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The man she had been secretly seeing, the man who had made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years, was gone. And the man she had betrayed, James, was standing just feet away, his eyes wide with disbelief, the weight of his actions settling over him like a suffocating blanket. Emma didn't know how long they stood there, frozen in the chaos of the moment. The flashing lights of the police cars reflected off the surface of the lake, casting an eerie glow over the scene. Everything felt unreal, as though this nightmare was happening to someone else. But it wasn't someone else. It was her life, her choices, her mistakes. James, Emma's voice cracked as she looked at her husband. Her heart ached, but it wasn't just for Aiden. It was for James too. For everything they had lost, for everything she had destroyed. James didn't respond. He just stood there, his chest heaving with every breath, his hands trembling at his sides. His eyes were vacant, distant, as though he was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Emma reached out to him, but he stepped back, his eyes flickering to Aiden's body and then back to her, as if he couldn't decide which one of them was the greater betrayal. "You killed him," Emma whispered, the words heavy with a mix of horror and disbelief. "You killed him, James." "I didn't. I didn't mean to," James stammered, his voice breaking as he dropped to his knees beside her. "I lost control. He took you from me, Emma. I couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't stand the thought of losing you." His voice trailed off, but Emma could see the weight of his regret in his eyes, the sorrow that mirrored her own. Emma didn't know what to say. There were no words that could undo the damage that had been done, no words that could bring Aiden back, or heal the rift between her and James. She had chosen the wrong path, betrayed the trust of the person who had once been her everything, and in doing so, had lost everything that mattered. The sound of footsteps behind them broke the silence, and soon, police officers were flooding the scene. They quickly assessed the situation, handcuffing James and pulling him away from the body of Aiden. Emma barely registered the officers' actions as they took James into custody. All she could feel was the crushing weight of her choices. As she sat on the cold ground, her body shaking uncontrollably, she realized the truth she had been running from. The affair with Aidan hadn't just destroyed her marriage. It had destroyed her own sense of self, her integrity, and her ability to make decisions that would lead to happiness instead of regret. The lies, the secrecy, the excuses, they had all led to this. To the moment where a life was lost, a family was broken, and no one would walk away from this unchanged. The reality of what had happened hit her like a wave, leaving her breathless and empty. She had thrown away the life she had built with James, the man who had been her partner, her confidant. And for what? A fleeting moment of passion, an escape from the emptiness that had slowly crept into her marriage. But the escape had come at a price. And now, there was no going back. In the weeks that followed, the small town of Mission Viejo was rocked by the scandal. Whispers spread like wildfire through the community, each new detail more shocking than the last. Emma's life was no longer her own. The media coverage was relentless, the judgment from the people she once called friends was crushing. No one wanted to be associated with the woman whose affair had led to a tragic death. As for James, he was charged with manslaughter, his future uncertain. The once successful, confident man who had built his life around work, family, and security was now facing the consequences of his uncontrollable rage. His actions had been driven by pain, by a deep sense of betrayal, but none of that mattered now. A man was dead, and James was the one who had taken his life. Emma faced her own reckoning. She lost more than just her marriage. She lost the trust of those around her, her reputation, and any hope of returning to the life she had once known. In the quiet moments, when the noise of the world had faded, she could only think of the one question that had haunted her since the day everything fell apart: was it worth it? The affair, the lies, the broken promises, in the end, it all amounted to nothing. Nothing but regret. This story is one of heartbreak, deception, and tragedy. It shows how easily a life can be derailed by a single choice, a single moment of weakness. It's a reminder that no matter how perfect things may seem on the surface, there are always cracks waiting to be exposed. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild, and the consequences of our actions can reverberate far beyond what we ever anticipate. For Emma, there is no going back. For James, there is only the uncertain path ahead, filled with the weight of his choices. And for Aidan, his life was taken before it ever really had a chance to begin. What do you think about this story? Do you believe the affair was the catalyst for the downfall of both families, or do you think the underlying issues in Emma and James' marriage were the real cause of the tragedy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a difficult situation like this? How would you have handled it? Feel free to share your experiences and join the discussion. We'd love to hear your perspective.